places like Detroit, and Katrina was a little bit like it for New Orleans. It takes at least in Detroit, it took us getting to a point where we no longer had any options. We had to deal with the structural deficiencies that were crushing us. And so we now have, for the first time in 40 years, a white mayor in Detroit. It doesn't matter if it's white, black, yellow, it doesn't matter. The fact is, it is a huge signal that Detroit is thinking about the leadership as opposed to the person or the affiliation or the race or anything like that. That's huge. We have a governor who is a Republican governor that has an urban agenda. He is about as democratic in his urban agenda as you'll ever find, but yet is a Republican governor, and he's had the strength of a Republican legislature behind him that has been supportive. So fast forward, and the work that that we did to one, keep the patient alive and put the infrastructure and the bones together, we now are in a much better position because we have those assets in place and we have the leadership in place, and the two are really what's driving the success going forward. Is that the answer?
Question about the connections between your public spaces and the development around it. Is it a situation where you just built it and they came, or was there a significant planning and management aspect of developing the public space at the same time, or with some real formal connections with the development around it?
Yeah. Again, good question. So how much of it was sort of forethought and planning versus reacting to the development that was coming? It's a little bit of both, and it depends on the situation. In the case of Campus Martius, which I think is probably a little bit like Duncan Square, it was very deliberate planning. So we thought about what were the development sites around it, how would they relate, what were the connections in terms of the future development that would not only be necessary to support the park, but also the park would be necessary to support. And so there was a lot of thought and process gone into that. On the Red Wing Arena, for instance, and the 250 acres, lots of thought in terms of the public space and the planning of that public space. But the other four parks and the sort of the linkages between those parks and the span from development to development between those parks has been much less planned in Detroit than in my opinion, would be beneficial and helpful. We had a situation where literally 3 years ago, Dan Gilbert decided he wanted to move his family of companies into town. For those of you that don't know Dan, I don't know how many people don't know him, but for those that don't know Dan, he's the owner of the Cleveland Cavaliers and Quicken Loans, and is a very aggressive entrepreneur. He has, as I said, bought 60 buildings, invested. The public number is $1.5 billion. The reality is it's well over a couple $2 billion in the core of downtown. This is the same as the core of. So think about one person owning 60 buildings and investing $2 billion in the core of downtown New Orleans. That's what he's done in Detroit. And so if we had a more proactive plan and master plan in place, which was one of the things I was working on prior to him coming, but we just didn't get finished, I think we probably would be a little bit better off. So we're then playing catch up now and trying to make sure that we're fully embracing the momentum that he's brought, but at the same time creating a sustainable network of downtown developments and public spaces. Does that help? Yeah.
We also have the 300th anniversary coming up. If we wanted to have a new urban park to support the residential development that's going on downtown, what ideas would you give to us for funding? Because while New Orleans is doing well, we're still a relatively poor city, and we don't have that millionaire that's going to move in downtown and buy 60 buildings.
Yeah, and we didn't have Dan Gilbert when we did these public spaces either. We didn't even think, he wasn't even a notion when we were doing them. So, and he actually is not supported. He's been very supportive of the operating costs over the last 3 years and the activation, especially of Campus Martius. So Campus Martius, just to digress for a second, its annual budget just for baseline activities is about $1.5 million. You know, and that for the last 10 years has been about our burn rate on an annual basis to, you know, have the cafe, to have the ice skating rink, to have the concerts in the park, and, you know, so that it's about $1.5 million to activate that park on an annual basis. Since Gilbert has been there, our annual budget for that park has increased to $3 million. $3 million, $3.5 million. And that's because, so, you know, we have benefited from his arrival, but it's been additive to the base that we had already created. In terms of, you know, activating a public space in the anticipation and support of new development, I think there are a couple things from a funding perspective. One, I think in the early stages there are foundations that understand the importance of this. There are a lot more foundations that are focused on quality of life in public spaces and you know, just building healthy places. So I would encourage, and I know Kurt, you know, is very familiar, and DDD is very familiar with a lot of these organizations, but I would encourage an active outreach to those foundations for the planning component of the initial planning pieces of this. We've been very successful in getting funding for those kinds of activities from some of the national foundations, and we obviously have a very strong local foundation community. Not sure that New Orleans has as strong a local foundation community, but we've been benefiting from that. In terms of the actual capital, I think there's a number of different ways, and the TAP that was just wrapped up here locally identified a lot of that, but I think there is a combination. You can't do it with just any one source. So, you know, I don't know whether there's any additional capacity off of the tax capture that's already here, or whether there's an opportunity to create an overlay for that specific purpose. Richard Barron is a great example on the riverfront. We actually have gone to Richard Barron, and he's volunteered. We're thinking about making it a little less of a volunteer program going forward, but he's volunteered to contribute about 10 cents a square foot annually to the operation and capital needs of the riverfront. If we do that with every development that occurs, you know, we're banking on it, but if we do that with every development, and then we put it in you know, a fund as opposed to just spend it, we then can leverage that. The other thing that we've done and toyed around with is the corporate community. So the corporate community has a huge benefit from improved infrastructure. We're looking at it not only from the public space infrastructure, but also from things like fiber and electric and you know, power grid and water and sewer. We believe there is a value proposition to having quality infrastructure. There is, you know, opportunities to reduce downtime. There's opportunities to increase productivity, and you know, there's opportunity to not only retain employee base, which is extremely costly when you think about turnover, but also recruit better quality talent. So we've tried to monetize that, and then we actually are asking the corporate community to bond with their, again, these are the larger companies, but to bond against that, to provide some funding. So that's a little bit more innovative, newer idea on how to do that. But at the end of the day, it is sitting in a room with all of your partners and trying to hash out a capital stack that ultimately gets you to where you need. The one thing that we didn't do as well on Campus Martius, and we're doing a better job on the riverfront, and you know, we're now putting the pieces in place on Campus Martius, is we stopped, once the park was built and operating, we stopped trying to build the endowment. So we had plans to endow the park with $10 million. We ended it. We stopped that endowment raise at $3.5 million, and that was a huge mistake because not all times are good. You know, markets have cycles, and in order to really, you know, create a sustainable public space, you got to have the capacity to get through some of those, and the endowment is what allows you to do that. So hopefully that's a little helpful, and there's a lot more, you know, conversation around funding.
We showed different parts that you were doing. Do you have any map that shows all the parts that are going now and talk about some of the interaction between them? It might have shown it, but
I don't know that I have that on this. Let me see whether I've got something here. But I can Conservancies are huge. Trying to think real quick. I'm not sure that, I'll have to find it, and I'm happy to forward it, but we have created a district, just so, we've got a 5-district plan for the downtown that is very focused on the activation, and I'll find it and get it around. I'll get it, you know, Kurt, and he can pass it around. But there is actually, we brought in 5 consultants. PPS led People for Public Space led the effort, Fred Kent. And so we have a placemaking book. And I don't know, did Bob, when you were there last week, did he go through that with you? A little bit. So I'll get that effort, because there's a lot of really good sort of insight as to what we were thinking, how we were activating. You'll be different, your style and makeup will be different, but I think it's a useful tool. So conservancies. Conservancies are incredibly important, especially early on, because you gotta get the constituencies that really care and matter together. And there's no other way to do that than through, in my opinion, no other way to do that than through sort of a new entity and a conservancy entity that is literally just focused on that one initiative. We happen to have a Riverfront Conservancy and a 300th Conservancy. 300 was responsible for our campus marshes, the Riverfront for the Riverfront. People want to know that their energy and dollars are dedicated to whatever it is that they're focused on. So the Conservancy allows you to do that. I think once you get to a certain point, though, and we're there, I think, with the 300 Conservancy, and quite frankly, I think we're there with the Riverfront as well. I just don't, if I were king for a day, I would have the Riverfront, under one conservancy with campus marshes as opposed to these individual. I think there's a point where you get those efforts stabilized, and then they should come back together, because there's an efficiency, and they should come back together under an organization, whether it's DDD or some other organization, but they should come back to an organization that has the reputational ability and capacity to manage those public spaces going forward. But starting out, conservancy is key. It also happens to help with the foundation communities, because they like to know that it's not that there is an entity that's its sole purpose. So, any other questions?
Yes, with regard to real estate investment, the strategy of freezing the real estate taxes was very attractive. One of the challenges with looking at or new investors coming in is that the appreciation of the real estate prices would then accelerate back to what they should be, which creates some hardship with being able to budget out what that expense would be. You guys resolve that issue, was there a strategy in place to keep it attractive and then continue the second, third round of reinvestment?
Yeah, Detroit is still, so the question is, when you start to, freeze real estate taxes or provide any kinds of incentive that then ultimately burn off, and you get back to sort of market rate and economics, what's the impact on further development? Detroit is still very much in a situation where we are relying on the subsidies. So on the residential side, we are knocking up against $2 a square foot, but the reality is we're probably, on average at about $1.65. That's woefully low, insufficient to support any kind of new construction, much less any kind of really market, purely market financed development. So we still are relying on a number of the tax incentives, whether they be new markets or historic. We've replaced our brownfield. The state has replaced our brownfield credits with a grant program. So it's CBG, but it's a pool of $100 million annually that you can access to close gaps. You can take $1 million as a grant, or you can take up to $10 million as a low interest loan, depending on which is better for the situation. We've had some Renaissance zones, obviously, that froze taxes. Those are still in effect, and we haven't felt the impact of the uncapping of those taxes yet. seeing the increased taxes benefiting things like the biz and the tax capture area for the DDA. Because for a long time, our values were going the opposite way, and our ability to service obligations, much less take on new obligations, was impacted. So I can't tell you exactly what's going to happen when the rent zones completely unwind. They're coming due, and the state has no interest in extending them or developing it even further. I have a 40-acre industrial park that is on a Renaissance zone, and it is about a $3 advantage to my tenants to be in that Renaissance zone. It's based on personal property as opposed to real estate taxes, and so we're already working on some ways to deal with that, so that all of a sudden their overall occupancy cost doesn't makes it less competitive. But we have not yet felt it, but we still are very heavily reliant on subsidies.
Well, it would seem that if your strategy to increase the population is based on homeowners, you're gonna have significant challenge. It's based on bringing in people who are leasing, then sees the position.
Yeah, the question, just for those in the back, challenge for homeowners, because of the tax structure, not so much for renters. The tax structure and the subsidies are a challenge for the developers of obviously the rental product versus the home buyers. The problem that we've had in Detroit and it's downtown and in the neighborhoods, with home buying is we don't have any comps. Any comps that we do have, the average home price is $5,000. Quite frankly, that's a bigger problem for us than any tax issues. The values in Detroit are still at a point where if somebody wants to buy, there are a lot of people that can afford to buy. The problem is you can't get it financed because we don't have any real comp. Now we've been working with a program. I started a nonprofit 5 years ago called Community Investment Support Fund. It was based out of the New Market Tax Credit. So rather than just use New Market Tax Credits for brick and mortar, we were using it for operating deficiencies for nonprofits, and we were going to have that fund basically 125% of the property value for homeowners, so that we could create an artificial appraisal. And so we're working on some of those kinds of things, but lots of creativity to get around that stuff. What else? Yes.
These massive developments will require good designing teams and construction teams. And my question to you is, what kind of opportunities are you providing to the disadvantaged business enterprises related to this construction? How you are approaching, or what kind of opportunities you are providing to this type of smaller companies to be participating in this type of construction?
So, great question. How are we engaging, especially disadvantaged with local companies? And our problem in Detroit, which is a great problem to have, but is going to be a real problem, is we're not going to have enough skilled labor, much less labor in general to deal with all of this. We already, if you end up with the bridge, the Red Wings, there's about 2 million square feet that Dan Gilbert has, under design. Trying to think what other major projects are. Anyway, we're woefully underserved in terms of skilled labor. So we have a very, very proactive engagement with local companies, local apprenticeships, all of the unions we're working with. There is a Detroit Black Chamber that is very focused on helping create entry-level opportunities. And to be perfectly frank, the challenge has been the unions haven't wanted to accept it. It's been an old boys network, and so they have been reluctant to really provide the entry-level training that is necessary. And so through the city's efforts, and then with the developers cooperation, we actually have created a number of different programs, big and small, because it can't be a one-size-fits-all, because it'll crush the smaller developers where the bigger guys can handle it. Where we are actively engaging those companies and those individuals. We have our workforce development department within the city is conducting job fairs and classes. The Red Wing Arena actually, I guess it was just Monday, had a job fair for 6,000 people for that project. So we are trying to, we've recognized that as an issue, and we're trying to put in place, and we actually have had, looks like I'm getting the hook, but we actually have had, and thankfully, because I was just about to start a Frank Sinatra song, we've had a lot of success in building a program. So if you'd like to see some of the stuff that we've done, if that becomes an issue here, or it's something that you're wrestling with, the City of Detroit is really trying to focus on that. We're trying to do it, a lot of folks in the neighborhoods have focused on a community benefits ordinance or agreement. We've tried to really resist that, because that ends up being that one-size-fits-all program. We're very much focused on making sure that there's early and often conversations going on about that, but not trying in effect legislate it. So, thank you. This was great. A lot of fun.
Thank you, Eric. There certainly was a lot of food for thought, and I think we all can see the many parallels between Detroit, my hometown, and New Orleans, my adopted hometown. So I think this is going to be an ongoing conversation between us and Detroit, and anywhere else, frankly, that can help us learn and do a better job, and that we can help along their way at the same time. I recognized Todd earlier, but I think I forgot to explicitly thank the Roosevelt for hosting this today. So thanks to the Roosevelt, a fabulous job. We had food for thought, and we had really good food. I mean, real food. Once again, thanks to our team at D&D for pulling this off, and to all of you who show up for these things. I hope that you will give us feedback on what works about our Leading Minds Breakfast, what you'd like to see improved, because we are in the job of continuous quality improvement in the community, and we will certainly use that feedback. But thank you for being here. I think it was a great conversation, and thanks one last time to Eric.